What if I told you the people you call African Americans aren't African at all? What if I told you they're Judah, the royal tribe of Israel, and that the rest of the so-called lost tribes are still here too, living in Haiti, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Mexico, even across Africa itself? The whole time, the truth was hiding in plain sight. They said the lost tribes of Israel vanished into history, that they were scattered and forgotten. But the evidence, the migration patterns, the cultural echoes, the prophecies lining up like puzzle pieces, tells a different story. The tribes didn't disappear, they moved. And today, they live on in the very people America and the world tried hardest to erase. Here's the breakdown. Judah Black Americans, descendants of kings, carried on slave ships. Levi Haitians, priestly lineage, keepers of spiritual fire. Benjamin Jamaicans and West Indies, warriors with unshakable pride. Ephraim Puerto Ricans, Joseph's seed alive in the islands. Manasseh Cubans and Dominicans, the brother tribe to Ephraim. Simeon Dominicans again, sharing Hispaniola with Levi. Gad Native Americans, the First Nations dispossessed, echoing Israel's warriors. Reuben South America, Brazil, Guyana, Suriname. Issachar Mexicans, tied to prophecy about labor, strength and land. Zebulun Central Americans, Guatemala, Panama, Honduras, between the seas. Asher Africa's coastal regions, blessed with oil and resources. Naphtali Pacific Islands, Polynesians, swift as the deer. Dan scattered in West Africa, remembered in names, migrations, and customs. Now pause. That's not coincidence, that's a map. The lost tribes aren't lost, they've just been renamed, reclassified, and lied about. But trace the roots, follow the migrations, listen to the culture, and you'll see it. Let's start with Judah. Judah was always the tribe of kings, David, Solomon, the royal line, and prophecy said Judah would be scattered far and wide, enslaved in ships, mocked and despised, yet never destroyed. Look at the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans, taken from West Africa, stripped of names, stripped of language, carried across the ocean in chains. That wasn't random. That was Judah, who became the backbone of America, but the most hated within it, who sings songs of captivity that sound like psalms rewritten in gospel rhythm, who marches for justice, but carries themselves with royal defiance. That's Judah. Black Americans are the descendants of the royal tribe, kings and queens, forced into bondage, but destined to rise again. Judah's story is exile and return, destruction and survival. In Babylon, they endured. In America, they endured. Every prophecy points back to them. Every struggle lines up with their legacy. And even now, their culture tells on itself. Gospel as psalms, blues as mourning songs, hip-hop as tribal prophecy on beats. Judah never stopped speaking. America just stopped listening. And Judah isn't alone, because right across the water, Levi burns in Haiti, Benjamin roars in Jamaica, Simeon shares Hispaniola, and Ephraim and Manasseh carry Joseph's blood through Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Each tribe scattered, each tribe alive, each tribe carrying its ancient role into the modern world. But everything starts with Judah, because once you understand Judah, their captivity, their resilience, their leadership, the rest of the map starts to make sense. Judah's story has always been one of exile. In the Bible, Judah was the last kingdom to fall, conquered by Babylon, and dragged into captivity. Prophets wrote of Judah, weeping by rivers, singing songs of Zion, in a strange land. Now look at African Americans, ripped from their homeland, stripped of language, names, and memory, yet still singing, still marching, still alive. The parallels aren't soft, they're exact. Judah was warned they would go into slavery in ships. What does the transatlantic slave trade look like, if not that prophecy fulfilled? Judah was told they would be mocked, called by words, despised among nations. Does that not sound like centuries of being called everything except what you are? The captors knew what they were doing. Slave traders targeted West Africa, a region thick with Hebrew customs that had lingered for centuries. Families practicing circumcision, names echoing Hebrew roots, oral traditions tied to an ancient homeland. They knew they weren't just taking Africans, they were taking Israelites. And once in America, Judah bore the heaviest chains, enslaved, segregated, lynched, imprisoned, every system designed to crush them, and yet, they refused to vanish. That's Judah's fingerprint, survival where others would break. Look at the culture. Negro spirituals were coded psalms, songs of Moses, songs of exile, songs of deliverance, disguised in Christian clothing, but carrying Hebrew soul. Go Down Moses wasn't just a song, it was a cry of identity. Judah remembering who they were, even when they couldn't say it out loud. Fast forward, gospel, blues, jazz, hip-hop. These aren't random genres. They're Judah's way of speaking, prophesying, and preserving memory through rhythm. The same way David played the harp to drive out despair, Judah beats drums and rhymes words to heal, to resist, to lead. And leadership. Judah still leads. In the Bible, Judah marched first in battle. In America, Judah leads every movement for justice, from civil rights to culture shifts. It's Judah who moves first. Judah who shakes nations. Judah who sets the tone. Judah's captivity became America's economy, but Judah's resilience became America's conscience. The kings became slaves, but the slaves became voices too loud to silence. That's Judah, and that's why the system fights so hard to erase their true name. But Judah's not the only piece of this puzzle. Right across the water, another tribe kept its identity burning in the Caribbean, Levi. If Judah is the tribe of kings, Levi is the tribe of priests. In ancient Israel, Levi had no land inheritance. Their role was different: to minister, to teach, to guard the spiritual fire. And when you look at Haiti, the match is impossible to ignore. Haiti has always carried a priestly fire, a spiritual authority that shook empires. The Haitian Revolution wasn't just a war, it was a spiritual uprising. Enslaved Africans, many carrying Hebrew customs mixed with African traditions, rose up under spiritual leadership and broke the chains of the most powerful empire of the time. No other nation of enslaved people pulled that off. That's Levi energy. Think about it. Levi in the Bible wasn't about land or wealth. They were about service, about guiding the people, about channeling spiritual power. Haiti echoes that role, from voodoo ceremonies that sparked revolts to spiritual resilience against centuries of foreign oppression. Levi has stood as a priestly tribe in exile. And notice, Haiti pays the highest price for that fire. The world punishes them, isolates them, calls them cursed, just like Levi in Israel lived scattered, dependent on the offerings of others. Haiti has been forced into economic strangulation, yet through poverty, through natural disasters, through invasions, Levi's flame doesn't die. It burns hotter. Levi's music carries the chant of priests. Their drums beat with ceremony. Their resilience defies explanation. They don't bow, they lift. That's Levi. And Levi doesn't stand alone. Sharing the island of Hispaniola with them is another tribe, Simeon. Where Levi brings priestly fire, Simeon brings warrior grit, and together they reflect an ancient bond written in their shared homeland. But before we get to Simeon, look one island over, because if Levi is Haiti, then Benjamin is Jamaica, and Benjamin's story is one of warriors who refused to be tamed. Benjamin was the smallest tribe in Israel, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in ferocity. The Bible calls them fierce archers, warriors who stood toe-to-toe with enemies, never backing down. Now look at Jamaica and the West Indies, and tell me you don't see Benjamin's fingerprints all over that soil. From the Maroons in Jamaica, who escaped plantations and built free communities in the mountains, to the fighters in Trinidad and Barbados who resisted colonial power. Benjamin has always carried that warrior spark. They didn't just survive slavery, they fought back, escaped, and built lives on their own terms. That's Benjamin energy, survival through strength, defiance, and fight. Even in music, Benjamin roars like a lion. Reggae, dancehall, dub. This isn't just entertainment, it's protest, prophecy, and warrior chants wrapped in rhythm. Bob Marley wasn't just singing love songs, he was channeling ancient Benjamin, speaking against Babylon, reminding his people they were more than what the world called them. And notice this, Benjamin and Judah have always been close. In the Bible, Judah and Benjamin stuck together when the kingdom split. In the Caribbean and America, they still stand side by side. African Americans, Judah and Jamaicans, Benjamin share culture, music, and resistance like brothers. Benjamin's spirit is loud, rebellious, and unshakable. When you think of Jamaica's image worldwide, fearless, fiery, unapologetic, you're looking at the tribe of Benjamin still alive and thriving. But Benjamin isn't the only tribe of Joseph's kin spread through the islands, because if Judah rules, Levi serves, and Benjamin fights, then Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, live in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Their story runs deep, because they were destined to be a multitude of nations. In Israel's story, Joseph was the one sold into slavery, the one who rose to power in a foreign land, the one who fed nations during famine. His two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were adopted by Jacob as full tribes, carrying Joseph's blessing into the future. Jacob even said Ephraim would be greater, a company of nations, while Manasseh would become strong in his own right. Now look at Puerto Rico, Ephraim, and Cuba, Dominican Republic, Manasseh, two island peoples, tied by history, culture, and struggle, but each with their own flavor. Ephraim, Puerto Ricans, fit that company of nations prophecy. Puerto Rico has always been in between worlds, claimed by Spain, then the US, yet carrying African, native, and Hebrew echoes in their bloodline. Their identity is layered, complex, and global. Ephraim has always been about blending and multiplying, and Puerto Rico shows that in music, in migration, in culture that spreads worldwide. Manasseh, Cubans and Dominicans, reflect strength and resilience. Think of Cuba's long resistance to empire, holding its identity under centuries of outside control. Think of the Dominican Republic, tied directly to Haiti, Levi on the same island, carrying echoes of Simeon as well. Manasseh is about endurance, about holding ground when the world pushes in. That's their story. And here's where it gets even deeper. Joseph's story was about surviving exile, being enslaved, then rising in power in a land not his own. Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, they've lived that, conquered, enslaved, colonized, yet still carrying rhythm, faith, and family strong enough to survive. They embody Joseph's legacy. So now we've mapped Judah in America, Levi in Haiti, Benjamin in Jamaica, and Joseph's sons in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. But don't think it ends with the islands, because some tribes didn't sail across seas. They stayed closer to home, rooted deep in the Americas. Gad and Reuben's story is next, and their trail runs across Native America and South America itself. We just traced Joseph's sons through the Caribbean, Ephraim in Puerto Rico, Manasseh in Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. But the migrations didn't just stay on islands. Some tribes were already woven into the very soil of the Americas, and two of the clearest, Gad and Reuben. In the Bible, Gad was known as a troop, all warriors who would fight, endure, and eventually overcome. Reuben, the firstborn of Jacob, carried a legacy of instability, but also of strength. Now picture Native Americans, the First Nations of North America. Picture the tribes of South America, from Brazil to Suriname. Do you see it? Gad and Reuben, still walking the earth. Let's start with Gad. Gad equals sign Native Americans. They were warriors from the beginning. They fought off invasion, stood as protectors of their land, and endured centuries of genocide and betrayal. Gad was always described as a tribe that would be attacked, beaten down, but still rise at the end. That's the native story. Pushed onto reservations, stripped of culture, yet still alive, still dancing, still remembering. Now Reuben, the firstborn who lost his birthright, scattered, and often overshadowed by his brothers. Doesn't that echo South America? Millions of indigenous and Afro-descended people whose contributions are overshadowed, yet they hold the oldest roots in the land. Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, places where the identity is mixed, scattered, but still undeniably tied to the first inheritance. Together, Gad and Reuben remind us that the tribes didn't just cross oceans, they were here, rooted in the Americas, carrying Israel's warrior and firstborn energy into new worlds. And this is where the map gets sharper, because if Gad is the warrior nations of North America and Reuben is the firstborn seed in South America, then who carries the role of Issachar and Zebulun? Look no further than Mexico and Central America. Issachar was described as a strong donkey, bearing burdens, tied to labor and land. Zebulun was told they would dwell at the haven of the sea, living between waters, trading and traveling. Now look at Mexico and Central America. Issachar is Mexico. Zebulun is the strip of nations between the Caribbean and Pacific. Guatemala, Panama, Honduras. Issachar's identity shows in the people's unmatched work ethic, tied to land and labor. Mexicans are often stereotyped as the hardest workers in the Americas, a reality rooted not in stereotype, but in prophecy. Fields, farms, construction sites. Issachar has always borne burdens with strength. But here's the twist. Issachar's prophecy wasn't just about work, it was about endurance. They carry weight others won't, yet they survive and thrive. That's Mexico's story. Now Zebulun. These are the nations sitting between seas. Look at the map. Guatemala, Honduras, Panama. Nations defined by ports, trade routes, migrations across waters. Zebulun was destined to live by the coasts, tied to commerce and movement. And what defines Central America, if not being a bridge between oceans, a hub of trade, a crossroads of cultures? Issachar and Zebulun together explain why Central and North America's indigenous and Afro-descended people share so many cultural ties to ancient Israel. Their food, their festivals, their rhythms, their survival through oppression. It's prophecy lived out in real time. And if Issachar and Zebulun show us Israel alive in Mexico and Central America, the next tribes pull us back across oceans and into Africa itself. Because Asher and Naphtali's trail takes us to the coasts of Africa and the islands of the Pacific, places rich in oil, abundance, and swiftness of spirit. We just walked through Issachar in Mexico and Zebulun in Central America, but the trail doesn't stop there. Some tribes branched further out, into Africa's coasts, and into the far reaches of the Pacific. That's where Asher and Naphtali come in. Asher's blessing was abundance. Out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. In other words, Asher was tied to land, rich in resources, overflowing with oil, food, and wealth. Look at Africa's coastal nations, Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, Equatorial Guinea. These are the same places drenched in oil, gold, and minerals, places that for centuries have been plundered by outsiders. Asher's legacy was wealth, but that wealth attracted envy and exploitation. That's Africa's coastal story to this day. Then Naphtali. The Bible describes Naphtali as a hind let loose, swift as a deer, bringing forth goodly words. Naphtali is tied to agility, freedom, and expression. Where do we see that? The Pacific Islands, Polynesians, Hawaiians, Tongans, Samoans, cultures marked by swiftness,
by strength, by beauty in language, dance, and expression. They stretch across oceans like deer, leaping across fields, scattered yet graceful, always moving, always alive. Asher's abundance and Naphtali's swiftness paint a clear picture. Israel didn't just stay in one corner, they spread wide, from Africa's wealth-rich shores to the farthest islands of the sea. Prophecy said the tribes would be scattered to the four corners of the earth. Asher and Naphtali prove that scattering wasn't symbolic, it was literal. And as we follow the map, two more tribes take center stage, Dan and Simeon, one scattered across West Africa, the other sharing a homeland with Levi on Hispaniola. Together they show how Israel's legacy doubles back, intertwining in the very same lands we've already traced.
Dan's story was always complicated. In the Bible, Dan was a tribe that often drifted, scattered, and struggled with idolatry. Yet they carried a fierce identity, leaving their mark wherever they went. Today, Dan is found across West Africa, in tribes, names, and customs that echo ancient Israel. Look at Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, the names of towns, the traditions of circumcision, the echoes of Hebrew words in African languages. Dan's fingerprints are all over the region. Some scholars even note names like Dan, showing up in rivers and lands, exactly as prophecy hinted. Dan shall judge his people. Dan shall be a serpent by the way. Dan scattered, but he left trails, weaving through West African identity. Now Simeon. If Levi is Haiti, then Simeon is the Dominican Republic. Same island, different tribes, just like brothers sharing land in ancient times. Simeon was known for fierce anger, for being divided and scattered. Doesn't that echo the Dominican Republic's history, sharing an island with Haiti, forever tied yet divided by politics, race, and colonial manipulation? One side Levi, one side Simeon, priest and warrior living on the same soil, divided but never separate. Simeon's energy is bold, fiery, often conflicted. Dominican culture reflects it, proud, passionate, full of rhythm, but marked by centuries of division. Yet even in that division, Simeon's identity stands strong, echoing its biblical role. With Dan scattered in Africa and Simeon rooted in the Caribbean, the map is nearly complete. But one tribe still ties it all together, Judah's brother tribes in prophecy, Issachar, Zebulun, and now the final connections of migration through history. And this is where the scattering of Israel into exile connects directly with the slave trade itself. Now that we've walked through each tribe, Judah in America, Levi in Haiti, Benjamin in Jamaica, Joseph's sons in the Caribbean, Gad in Native America, Reuben in South America, Issachar in Mexico, Zebulun in Central America, Asher in Africa, Naphtali in the Pacific, Dan in West Africa, Simeon in the Dominican Republic. The big question hits: how did they get there? The answer starts long before Columbus, long before the Middle Passage. It starts with the Assyrian exile. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel, 10 tribes strong, was conquered by Assyria. They were taken captive, scattered into foreign lands, and pushed out of their homeland. History says they vanished, became the lost tribes. But vanish doesn't mean disappear. It means they moved. They migrated. They became wanderers, traders, slaves, refugees. Over centuries, they filtered into Africa, mixing with locals, building new communities, carrying fragments of Israelite customs wherever they went. Then Babylon struck Judah and Benjamin, scattering them too. By the time Rome controlled the region, Israelites were already spread across Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. That's why when you look at Africa, you see so many Hebrew echoes: circumcision, naming traditions, dietary laws, oral storytelling, clan structures. Israel was there long before the slave ships arrived. Fast forward to the 1500s, the transatlantic slave trade explodes. And who gets targeted? West Africa, the very region where exiled Israelites had settled generations earlier. Traders didn't just capture Africans, they captured Israelites hidden in Africa, living among African nations, their identity blurred, but never erased. That's why the parallels hit so hard. Prophecy said Israel would go into slavery in ships, scattered across nations, mocked by bywords, stripped of their name. The transatlantic slave trade checks every box. Millions ripped from West Africa, shipped to America, the Caribbean, and South America. That wasn't coincidence. That was prophecy playing out. And notice the destinations: America for Judah, Haiti for Levi, Jamaica for Benjamin, Puerto Rico and Cuba for Ephraim, and Manasseh, Brazil for Reuben, Mexico for Issachar, Central America for Zebulun. The slave trade didn't just scatter people randomly. It mirrored the ancient tribal map, almost like history itself was resetting the pieces. That's the great migration of the lost tribes, from Assyria to Africa to the Americas, from exile to captivity to survival, always scattered, but never destroyed. So how do we know these migrations weren't just coincidence? How do we trace tribes across oceans and centuries? Look at the fingerprints, the cultural and spiritual markers that survived the scattering. Start with circumcision. West African tribes practiced it long before European contact. That wasn't common across Africa. It was concentrated in regions tied to Israelite settlement. Look at dietary customs. Many African groups avoided pork, honored dietary restrictions, and carried food laws echoing Levitical codes. These weren't imported by missionaries. They were ancient traditions, preserved through exile. Now consider oral storytelling. Israel's entire culture was oral. Genealogies, prophecies, laws passed down by word of mouth. African tribes carried the same system. Griots in West Africa held lineages, the same way Levites held genealogies. Oral memory became survival. Then there's music and rhythm. Hebrew worship was drum-heavy, call and response, communal. African music mirrors it perfectly. When Judah became slaves in America, those rhythms transformed into spirituals, gospel, blues, jazz, hip-hop, all rooted in the same ancient heartbeat. Even naming traditions tell on themselves. African names echo Hebrew sounds and meanings. Words for God, for family, for covenant, show up again and again, surviving centuries of exile and slavery. And don't forget festivals. African harvest festivals, purification rites, and coming-of-age ceremonies carry striking parallels to Israelite feasts and holy days. Even when stripped of names like Passover or tabernacles, the practices survived in new clothing. It's these fingerprints that prove the connection. The migration map isn't built on guesswork. It's built on customs, rhythms, names, laws, and survival strategies that stretch straight from ancient Israel to modern Africa and the diaspora. And the deeper you look, the more undeniable it becomes. The lost tribes aren't a myth. They're a reality. They live in the culture, in the music, in the faces of millions who never stopped carrying Israel's fire. But this story doesn't just live in the past. The revival is happening now. Across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, people are waking up to who they are. The lost tribes are finding their name again. For centuries, the story of the lost tribes was buried under lies. History books told us the tribes vanished. Churches said it was spiritual, not literal. Hollywood painted cowboys and kings as white. But now, the silence is cracking. The lost tribes are waking up. Across the world, black communities are connecting dots their oppressors hoped they'd never notice. Judah in America is realizing that their survival through slavery wasn't just endurance, it was prophecy. Hattians and Levi are recognizing their priestly role. The spiritual authority that made them the first free black republic in the modern world. Jamaicans and Benjamin are seeing that their warrior spirit isn't random, it's Benjamin still roaring. Even in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, the memory is surfacing. Ephraim and Manasseh,
are reclaiming Joseph's blessing, remembering that their exile was never the end of the story. Simeon is rediscovering itself alongside Levi, acknowledging the shared island of Hispaniola is more than coincidence. It's tribal destiny. Look at Africa. Across Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, groups are standing up and saying, "We are Israel." The Igbo of Nigeria, with traditions that mirror Hebrew law, circumcision, purity rites, and even ark-like shrines, declare themselves descendants of Israel. In Ethiopia, the Beta Israel community fought for centuries to keep Jewish practices alive. From the Lemba in southern Africa to tribes scattered across West Africa, the story is repeating. Israel never left. Israel was hidden in Africa all along. And it's not just history buffs saying this. Families pass stories down. Oral traditions whisper of Israelite ancestry. Songs, proverbs, and names that survived slavery suddenly make sense in this light. What looked like coincidence becomes connection. What looked like fragments becomes a mirror. The awakening is global. From African Americans chanting, "We are the chosen," to Haitians tying their revolution to prophecy, to Mexicans and Native Americans realizing their roots run deeper than colonial history, the tribes are remembering. And every revival brings a question: why was this hidden in the first place? If the lost tribes are real, if Judah is in America, Levi in Haiti, Benjamin in Jamaica, Gad in Native America, Issachar in Mexico, and the rest scattered across Africa and the diaspora, then why didn't we learn this in school? Why didn't churches preach it? Why was it buried? The answer is power. Think about it. If the world knew African Americans were Judah, the royal tribe of kings, would slavery have been possible? If the world knew Haitians were Levi, would France have dared to enslave priests? If the world knew Native Americans were Gad, would genocide have been sold as manifest destiny? No. To strip a people of freedom, you first strip them of identity. Colonial powers knew who they were stealing. European traders wrote about African tribes who kept Hebrew customs. Missionaries noticed strange similarities between African rituals and Israelite law. These weren't secrets, they were suppressed. Because if Judah knew they were Judah, captivity would crumble. If Israel knew who they were, the narrative of white supremacy would collapse. So they rewrote history. They painted Israel white. They erased African presence from the Bible. They turned Egyptians into Europeans in Hollywood. They made Moses look Scandinavian. They gave Jesus blonde hair and blue eyes. They scrubbed the black and brown truth out of scripture and out of classrooms until people forgot. But forgetting isn't forever. The truth leaks. The lies crack. Oral traditions outlast textbooks. Culture outlasts propaganda. And today, with the internet, the research, and the sheer hunger of a people ready to remember, the truth is rising again. That's why this matters. This isn't just about history, it's about identity, about dignity, about power. Because once you realize the tribes are alive and black, the whole world shifts. Colonialism becomes exposed. Racism looks weaker. The oppressed stop seeing themselves as victims and start seeing themselves as heirs. And that's the fear, not just of Europe, not just of America, but of every system built on keeping Israel asleep. Because once the lost tribes wake up, you can't control them with lies anymore. The awakening has started. Judah is stirring. Levi is remembering. Gad, Reuben, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Simeon, Dan. The pieces are falling back into place. And the more the truth spreads, the louder the question gets. What happens when all the tribes know who they are?
When you strip a people of their land, their names, their language, their God, what's left? For most, nothing. But Israel's tribes carried something deeper, a fire no chains could extinguish. That's why, even after exile, captivity, and centuries of lies, the culture never died. It just transformed. Take Judah in America. The plantation owners banned drums, fearing communication, but Judah turned their voices into instruments. Spirituals carried coded messages of escape and survival, while doubling as psalms of captivity. That rhythm never stopped. It evolved into blues, jazz, gospel, hip-hop. Each stage wasn't just music, it was prophecy disguised as art. Look at Levi in Haiti. Their ceremonies became revolutions. Vodou wasn't just religion, it was a language of liberation. The same priestly fire that lit incense in Jerusalem lit torches in Bois Caiman, sparking the only successful slave revolt in modern history. That's Levi carrying its priestly role into exile. Benjamin, in Jamaica, the warrior tribe, turned rebellion into anthem. Reggae, dancehall, dub, music that challenged empire, demanded justice, and kept identity alive. Bob Marley's cries of "get up, stand up" weren't random. They were Benjamin's warrior spirit, refusing to bow. Issachar in Mexico and Zebulun in Central America carried resilience through labor and land. Hard work became prophecy fulfilled. The ability to survive famine, exploitation, and colonial abuse while staying tied to the soil. That's Issachar and Zebulun, bearing burdens yet refusing to break. Even Gad, the native tribes, found ways to preserve identity under genocide. Powwows, oral traditions, sacred dances, all of it became survival strategies, keeping Gad's warrior soul alive despite centuries of erasure. And across Africa, Asher's abundance and Dan's scattered remnants still show. Oil, gold, diamonds, traditions, and names echoing Hebrew roots all remind us the fire never died. Culture was survival, song was scripture, dance was prayer, family was covenant. Every meal, every rhythm, every whispered story became resistance. The tribes may have been scattered, but they refused to let the flame go out. And that flame brings us to the question of the future. Because survival is one thing, revival is another. What happens when the tribes don't just survive, but wake up? The awakening isn't just about history, it's about destiny. Because once the tribes know who they are, everything changes. Think about Judah. For 400 years, African Americans were told they were slaves, then second-class citizens, then minorities. But what happens when Judah sees themselves not as victims, but as royal descendants of kings? That's a shift empires can't control. That's why this truth is feared. Levi, in Haiti, still struggling under economic chains. What happens when they remember their priestly role isn't poverty, it's leadership? Haiti's revolution was just a spark. What happens when Levi's flame burns full again? Benjamin in Jamaica, Ephraim in Puerto Rico, Manasseh in Cuba, Simeon in the Dominican Republic. What happens when the islands stop seeing themselves as scattered colonies and start seeing themselves as tribes of one nation? Suddenly, Caribbean identity becomes Israelite destiny. Issachar in Mexico, Zebulun in Central America. What happens when the hardest working peoples stop being exploited and start claiming their inheritance? Gad and Reuben, the native nations of North and South America. What happens when they realize their fight for land, sovereignty, and justice is not just politics, but prophecy? Asher in Africa, Naphtali in the Pacific, Dan scattered. What happens when they remember their blessings of abundance, speed, and judgment were never lost, only hidden? This is why history was rewritten. Because once the tribes wake up, colonial borders look fake, racial hierarchies look laughable, oppression looks small. The truth flips the script. The very people the world despised are the very people prophecy honored. The implications are massive. Identity means power, memory means strength, and unity, when the tribes recognize each other across oceans and continents, means a movement no empire can contain. That's the fear. That's why it was hidden. But the cracks are already showing. The tribes are stirring, the fire is rising, and the question isn't if the awakening will spread, it's how fast. And as we move deeper, the next chapters dig into this revival, how music, politics, and global movements are already reflecting tribal identity, even when people don't realize it. Sometimes revival doesn't look like a sermon, sometimes it looks like a beat drop, a protest, or a stadium full of people chanting words they don't even realize are prophetic. That's how the lost tribes move in today's culture, hidden in plain sight. Look at Judah, in America. Every major cultural wave of the last century has come out of Judah's survival energy. Jazz, blues, gospel, R&B, hip-hop, all of them are Judah speaking prophecy, in rhythm. Even when Judah doesn't say Israel, they're still channeling it. When Public Enemy shouted "Fight the power," that was Judah marching first into battle. When Kendrick raps about oppression, survival, and generational curses, that's Judah prophesying through bars. Levi in Haiti does the same with drums and ceremonies. Vodou rhythms became resistance songs. Carnival parades double as survival rituals. It's priestly fire disguised as festivity, keeping Levi's role alive even when the world mocks it. Benjamin in Jamaica. Reggae is Benjamin's heartbeat. Bob Marley's Babylon System wasn't just music, it was scripture with a bass line. Benjamin's warrior chants spilled out of Kingston into the world, preaching exile, identity, and rebellion against oppression. Ephraim in Puerto Rico, Manasseh in Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Salsa, reggaeton, rumba, bachata. These aren't just dance music. They're the sound of Joseph's sons blending nations, multiplying influence, spreading rhythms across the globe. Ephraim was destined to become a multitude of nations, and reggaeton, on every continent, proves it. Even Issachar and Zebulun show their fingerprints in modern culture. Mexican corridos and Central American folk songs carry themes of struggle, labor, and survival. Issachar's prophecy in sound. Culture never lies. Even when stripped of names and Bibles, the tribes left their mark in rhythm, protest, and art. That's revival. Not in temples, but in beats, in drums, in rhymes, in resistance. And revival doesn't stop at music. It bleeds into politics, resistance movements, and global struggles for freedom. That's where the tribes are waking up loudest. The lost tribes don't just survive in culture, they rise in resistance. Look across the globe, and you'll see it. Movements that look political on the surface, but run deeper, rooted in identity. Judah in America led the civil rights movement. Black power, Black Lives Matter, always first in the fight, always carrying the role of leadership. That's Judah, marching first into battle, just like in the wilderness. Levi in Haiti sparked the Haitian Revolution, the first black nation to break chains of slavery. That priestly fire lit the path for revolutions across Latin America and beyond. Benjamin in Jamaica carried rebellion into culture. From Maroons who fought the British to reggae that denounced Babylon, Benjamin has always resisted empire. Ephraim and Manasseh, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, have resisted colonial domination for centuries. From independence wars to modern protests against corruption, Joseph's sons live out survival in foreign lands, refusing assimilation. Issachar in Mexico and Zebulun in Central America. Look at migrant struggles. The world calls them laborers, but prophecy calls them survivors bearing burdens. Others won't. Their fight for dignity is tribal identity, disguised as politics. Gad in Native America resists through sovereignty battles, pipelines, land rights, water protection. Every protest camp is prophecy lived out. Gad attacked, dispossessed, but refusing to vanish. Asher in Africa faces a different fight, abundance stolen, oil, gold, diamonds, outsiders plunder Asher's inheritance. Yet Africa's resistance movements, from Nigeria to Angola, echo Asher rising against exploitation. Naphtali in the Pacific faces colonial pressures too, fighting to keep culture alive against tourism and empire. Their dances, chants, and resistance to erasure echo Naphtali's swiftness. Dan and Simeon's struggles mirror the same,
scattered identities, reclaiming pride, refusing to stay divided forever. All across the map, the tribes are resisting. And here's the kicker: these movements often echo the same words: freedom, justice, land, dignity. They don't always say Israel, but the message is tribal, it's prophetic. And when these scattered tribes recognize each other, when Judah in America sees Issachar in Mexico as kin, when Levi in Haiti connects with Asher in Africa, when Gad's sovereignty aligns with Judah's protests, the unity becomes unstoppable. Because prophecy never said Israel would vanish. It said Israel would scatter, and scattered things can regather. Broken pieces can fuse back into one nation. That's the revival, not just memory, but movement. And the more the tribes rise in unison, the more the systems built on lies start to shake. Every empire in history has thrived on one rule: divide and conquer. Keep people from knowing who they are, and you can make them work for you forever. The moment they remember, your empire cracks. That's why the awakening of the tribes is dangerous. Not dangerous to the people, dangerous to the systems built on their oppression. Think about Judah in America. If African Americans fully embrace their identity as Judah, the royal tribe, the kings, they stop seeing themselves as minorities, begging for rights, and start seeing themselves as heirs reclaiming inheritance. That shift alone terrifies governments and corporations who profit from Judah's labor, creativity, and resilience. Levi in Haiti. The world has punished Haiti ever since they broke free in 1804. Why? Because a nation of priests lit a flame that couldn't be put out. Haiti's awakening is feared because Levi doesn't just fight with weapons. They fight with spirit, with ceremony, with faith that outlasts bullets. Benjamin in Jamaica. They've always been the loudest voice against Babylon. From Maroon resistance to reggae revolution, Benjamin has never been quiet. Imagine Benjamin connected to Judah and Levi. Suddenly the Caribbean isn't just islands, it's tribes aligned. Now scale it globally. Issachar and Zebulun waking up in Central and North America. Gad reclaiming sovereignty in native lands. Asher and Dan recognizing their wealth in Africa as tribal inheritance, not just resources. Naphtali remembering their beauty and strength across the Pacific. The awakening terrifies power because it unites what was scattered. Colonizers need us divided: Africans versus Caribbeans, African Americans versus Native Americans, Hispanics versus blacks. But when those labels fall away and people see themselves as one family, Israel, the system has no grip left. That's why history was rewritten. That's why Hollywood whitewashed. That's why education erased. Because they knew the day Israel remembered itself would be the day oppression lost its teeth. And that day is arriving.
Picture this: the scattered tribes realizing they're one people. Judah in America, linking arms with Levi in Haiti. Benjamin in Jamaica, chanting alongside Simeon in the Dominican Republic. Ephraim and Manasseh, uniting across Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the islands. Issachar rising in Mexico. Gad standing strong in Native America. Asher and Dan reclaiming Africa's wealth. Naphtali dancing across the Pacific. This isn't fantasy, it's prophecy. And what does it mean for the world? First, it destroys the lie of white supremacy. If the very people who were enslaved and despised are revealed as Israel, the chosen people, then centuries of racism collapse overnight. Every chain of less than gets flipped into heir to. That's power. Second, it flips economics. That's power. Second, it flips economics. Africa's resources, Asher's oil, Dan's wealth, reclaimed as inheritance, means no more exploitation by foreign powers. Imagine Africa not begging the world, but standing as the supplier of abundance, united under identity. Third, it changes culture. Right now, Judah sets global trends in music, fashion, slang, and resistance without being credited. Imagine Judah doing it consciously, as leaders of Israel, connected to Benjamin, Ephraim, and the rest. Culture becomes covenant, not just entertainment. Fourth, it transforms politics. If Gad and Reuben reclaim their land rights as part of prophecy, suddenly native sovereignty movements aren't fringe, they're Israel rising. If Issachar and Zebulun see themselves as Israel, the migrant crisis shifts from illegal aliens to exiled tribes reclaiming place. It reshapes faith itself. The Bible stops being a book of other people's history and becomes the diary of the black, brown, and indigenous world. That alone changes how billions see themselves, no longer consumers of someone else's story, but central characters in their own. A reunited Israel doesn't just threaten governments, it rewrites nations. It turns colonies into tribes, slaves into heirs, scattered people into one unstoppable nation. And the systems know it. That's why they hide it. That's why they fear it. That's why they try to mock it. But prophecy doesn't bend to power. Power bends to prophecy. And prophecy says the tribes will rise. We've walked the map. Judah in America, Levi in Haiti, Benjamin in Jamaica, Ephraim and Manasseh in the Caribbean, Simeon sharing Hispaniola, Gad across Native America, Reuben in South America, Issachar in Mexico, Zebulun in Central America, Asher on Africa's coasts, Naphtali in the Pacific, Dan scattered through West Africa. They called them lost, but lost doesn't mean gone. Lost means hidden, and hidden things always resurface. For centuries, the world tried to bury this truth. They renamed us African, Native, Hispanic, Caribbean, minority. They stripped Hebrew names and replaced them with slave masters' surnames. They redrew maps, rewrote history, painted our prophets with pale faces, and told us we were nobodies. But the lie can't outlive the truth. The tribes didn't vanish. They endured. They survived captivity, colonization, genocide, poverty, and exile. And now they're rising. Judah never lost its voice. Every protest, every gospel song, every rap lyric was Judah crying out. Levi never lost its priestly fire. Every Haitian ceremony and revolution was Levi remembering. Benjamin never lost its roar. Every reggae chant was Benjamin standing against Babylon. Ephraim and Manasseh never lost Joseph's blessing. Every rhythm spreading from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the islands into the world was proof of a multitude of nations. Gad never stopped fighting. Every native resistance camp was Gad holding the line. Reuben never stopped enduring. Every Afro-Indigenous survival in South America was Reuben bearing burdens. Issachar never stopped working. Every Mexican laborer carrying weight no one else would. That's Issachar's prophecy lived out. Zebulun never stopped dwelling by the sea. Every Central American port, every migration route between oceans is Zebulun keeping its role. Asher's oil, gold and diamonds still shine in Africa, even when plundered. Naphtali's swiftness still dances across Polynesian waves. Dan's name still echoes in West Africa, in rivers, in customs, in memory. Simeon's fiery spirit still beats in the Dominican Republic, tied forever to Levi. The story of the tribes is the story of survival. Stripped of everything, they still carried identity in rhythm, in faith, in family, in spirit. And now, as the world cracks and empires shake, the tribes are stirring. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Because when the lost tribes embrace who they are, the narrative flips. Colonies become kingdoms, victims become heirs, slaves become royalty, and the oppressed remember they were always chosen. The world told us we were lost, but prophecy said we'd be scattered, not destroyed. And scattered seeds still grow. Now the tribes are regathering, in music, in culture, in movements, in memory. Judah is rising.
Levi is burning. Benjamin is roaring. Ephraim and Manasseh are multiplying. Simeon is awakening. Gad is fighting. Reuben is surviving. Issachar is enduring. Zebulun is trading. Asher is blessing. Naphtali is running free. Dan is remembering. The lost tribes were never lost. They were hidden in plain sight. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. So the question isn't, where are the lost tribes? The question is, now that they're awake, what comes next?